Hi gang. So let's start out with Chapter 2, and we're going to install Windows Server 2016 in this chapter. So the objectives for the chapter, we're going to determine the appropriate Windows Server 2016 installation requirements and the different editions. We're going to plan a Windows Server 2016 installation, install and configure Windows Server Core, and install and remove features using Features on Demand. Now, we've got different editions of Windows Server 2016, and each have their own requirements. Now, the editions are Data Center, Standard, Essentials, Multipoint Premium Server, Storage Server, and Hyper-V Server. Businesses can choose the best solution for their size and services required. Now, when it comes to Data Center Edition, you can install an unlimited number of virtual instances of the OS. Data Center and Hyper-V can be installed on a physical server. You can install as many virtual machines as you need. The features found in Data Center are not found in Standard Edition are Storage Spaces Direct, Storage Replica, Shielded Virtual Machines, and aspects of the networking stack that are based on the Microsoft Azure Cloud Computing System. Now, if we were dealing with just a Standard Edition, it has the most of the features of the Data Center Edition, but it doesn't have, like we said, Storage Spaces Direct, Storage Replica, Shielded Virtual Machines, and the new networking stack based on Azure. Standard Edition license permits only 2 virtual instances or Hyper-V containers. All Windows Server 2016 server roles and features are supported in both Data Center and Standard editions. Either edition can be configured as a domain controller, member server, or a standalone server. Now there's an Essentials edition, and it's aimed at small businesses with 25 or fewer users. You're automatically configured as a root domain controller. Other automatically configured services are Active Directory Certificate Services, DNS, File Services, Web Server with IIS, Network Policy Server, and Remote Desktop Services. It comes with a management interface called Dashboard. Other features include client backups and remote web access. There's no CALs required. Now, Multiport or Multipoint Premium Server Edition, that's volume licensing customers in academic markets only. Each user station can connect to the server directly using video cables, USB, or local area network connection. You could achieve the functionality of Multipoint Premium Server with Windows Server 2016 Standard Edition and Data Center Edition by installing the Multipoint Services role. Now, there's Windows Storage Server, and it's focused on making a computer a storage appliance. It's just storing data. Now, it can be configured as a network-attached storage device for file sharing applications, or as a block-level Internet small computer system interface storage device for shared storage applications. Many of these server roles you can install on Standard or Data Center editions, and they're not available on Storage Server. Now, Microsoft Hyper-V Server 2016. It's a free download with no licensing costs that allows you to make a server a Hyper-V virtualization server. It has all the features of the Hyper-V server role that you can install on Standard or Data Center editions. Now, when it comes to licensing considerations, Windows Server 2016 Standard and Data Center, they use a core-based licensing model instead of processor-based. And that was used in previous releases. Each processor core must be licensed for up to 2 physical processors, with up to 8 cores each. A Standard Edition allows 2 operating system environments or 2 Hyper-V containers for each fully licensed server. Data Center Edition allows an unlimited number of OSEs and Hyper-V containers. Now, standard and Data Center Editions require CALs for each client device or user that will be accessing the server. So we've got requirements for Data Center Edition and Standard Edition. Now, we've got to have a minimum of a 1.4 gigahertz 64-bit CPU. They recommend, now that's the bare minimum, they recommend at least a 3.1 gigahertz. The minimum, it won't run with anything less than 512 meg of RAM, which is, by today's standards, totally insufficient. We'd have a minimum of 2 gig of RAM or more. Okay. Now, when it comes to disk space, a minimum of 32 gig. They'd like you to see at least 60 gig. PCI Express, SATA, SAS, or SCSI disk controller. It doesn't support PAT or IDE. Additional drives, they recommend a DVD drive, but that's only if you're installing from DVD media. The catch is, Windows Server 2016 won't fit on DVD media. You need a PCI Express gigabit Ethernet adapter supporting PXE boot. And Super VGA or higher keyboard and mouse internet access when it comes to displaying your peripherals. Now, some networks require more planning than others. Now, smaller networks don't take many decisions. Larger networks take a lot of decisions and a lot of planning to make sure that the system is as productive and efficient as we plan it to be, or that we want it to be. Now, network environment and roles a server will play on the network are key considerations in planning Windows Server 2016 installs. Okay. We've got hardware considerations, the CPU architecture. Now, the server line includes AMD Opteron or Intel Xeon. Workstation or server line processor. Server supports up to 64 physical CPUs. Now, the total number of processors, it's the number of cores in each processor is the big deal, because they're looking at cores now, not just the processors. Multi-core CPUs aren't necessarily as good as multiple physical processors. Now, 32-bit versus 64-bit processors. Microsoft no longer makes a 32-bit version of its server OS. They're strictly NTFS or better. Virtualization extension CPU needs to support this if you want to run Hyper-V. Now, other things that we need to consider: the name of the server, the network protocol that we're going to use, IP addresses, a work group, or you're going to be a domain. What are the server roles that we're going to have to associate with the server? Now, are we going to perform a clean install? A clean install is one in which the OS is installed on a new disk partition and it's not an upgrade from a previous version of anything. Now, they say usually use a DVD, but we don't have a DVD that'll hold Server 2016. After installation begins, we can boot off a USB. After installation begins, a message displayed stating that Windows is loading files. You need to choose your language, time, and keyboard configuration. Now here we go. We start out. We've got our Windows Server 2016. Now, after we click install, you're prompted to enter your product code. Now, the only way around that is if you're doing an evaluation edition. Now, the next window will ask you which edition you want to install. Now, do you want to install Desktop Experience or do you want to install Server Core? Now, Server Core doesn't have a GUI. Now, it is more efficient and it's less resource intensive than desktop experience. Now, we'll talk about the difference between the two as we move ahead. You'll do server core installs later. That's in, I think, activity 2.5. Now, server core, the difference, server core, it's not GUI, so we're running PowerShell to do everything we need to do. Now, for performing a clean install, there's our setup. It goes through, we pick which one we're going to do. It's 2016 standard eval, 2016 standard desktop, data center eval. We'll move ahead. Now, after that, you'll accept the license terms and select whether you're going to upgrade or do a custom install. Now, when it comes to a custom install, you have to identify how you're going to format or partition, I should say, your drive itself. A custom install performs a clean install of Windows, but we've got to choose from the list of disks and partitions and specify where we're going to do our install. So this one, it shows that we've got a 127 gig drive and then no space is allocated, and there are no partitions at this point. It's just one clean open drive. We would go ahead and click next, and you can use load driver link to install a driver for a disk controller, or if you click the new link, you're prompted to create a new volume for the selected disk. If you select a disk and click next, Windows creates two volumes for you. One's about 350 meg, and that's system boot files. The other is your C drive, and that's where Windows and the other default OS files are going to be stored. It begins the installation. Your computer, it typically will restart twice. After the installation's finished, you'll be prompted to set the administrator password. So you will define administrator, everything about the administrator during the install. Now that password is, it's got a protocol we got to follow, or naming convention we've got to have. It's got to be a minimum of 3 characters that include the 3 of the following types. So it needs at least 3 from this list: uppercase, lowercase, numbers, and special symbols. So if you had uppercase, lowercase, and numbers, you're good. Uppercase, lowercase, special symbols, you're good. All right. Now, you'll get prompted, then you log on to open the server manager. We pop on through and it loads everything. Here's where we went through and we set the password we were just talking about, and it sets it for the administrator account. Now, what happens if you install the wrong edition? Use DISM-EXE, and you can go through and change or upgrade from one edition to the other. Just got to have the right key for that edition. Now, what happens if the disk wasn't found at that one stage where, let me back up and we'll go look at it. Right here. What happens if you don't see a disk there? There's nothing. And we've got to go check the physical connections, or it could be a bad disk. So as long as the connection is good and it's a valid disk, you should see your disk there. All right. It'll format it for you if it needs formatting, and it will be NTFS for Windows 2016 Server. All right. Now let's come back to where we were. Okay, so it could be a driver for the disk itself. You may have to install load driver link. You may have to install a driver for your disk controller. It'll ask you for the media, or to insert the medium that has the driver on it if it doesn't recognize the driver. Now, we've got to go through and activate Windows Server 2016. Activation should take place automatically, but if it doesn't, you need to do it within 10 days of installation. So we can use key management services, Active Directory-based activation, or automatic virtual machine activation. We've got to set the time date on it, or I should say the time zone of the date. And we need to assign an IP address. Servers should have a static IP address. Now you can use a GUI, or you can use the netsh command prompt to go set the IP address through PowerShell, through that commandlet, and that'll set your IP address there. The easiest way, if we're using data center, just go in the GUI and we're there. But if you're doing server core, you've got to go do it in PowerShell. Now, we've got to assign a computer name. Make sure the computer name follows the conventions that are industry standards. Okay. The name of the computer needs to identify what it is and what it does, and in some instances, where it is. Now we've got to configure and install updates. That is patches that are output by Microsoft on a regular basis to fix security vulnerabilities. We've got service packs. Those are little bug fixes and more little security updates. And we'll do updates on a regular basis. So we've got to configure and install updates early on. Let's get it out of the way before we start using this thing in production. So we've got to configure when the updates occur, and one of the things we'll deal with later is if we've got client machines, we're managing Windows 10 machines, we'll go ahead and receive the updates and push them out to those client machines, and not just manage our server updates, but also manage the client updates. So we can choose how the updates are installed, give me the updates from Microsoft products, when I update Windows, or I can defer feature updates. I'll push it off to another time. Okay. Now what's next? After your computer's configured and it's up to date. Now this updating can take a while sometimes. And one of the things about the latest and greatest incarnations of Win 10 and Win Server 16 is that they update more frequently than we'd seen in the past. You can start installing server roles and additional features once it's all up to date. Now most networks in a domain environment usually run these services at a minimum: Active Directory, DS, DNS, DHCP, and file and storage services. Now if you plan to use server virtualization, install Hyper-V role as well on your first server and install virtual machines to run server roles. And that'll act like Active Directory and DHCP. Now, if you're going to expand your network, when adding a new server, you have to decide whether the server will be one of the following. Is it a domain controller? Is it a member server? Or is it just a standalone server? Now, reasons to add servers to a network, company growth. We don't want to overload a server, so we can add a second one to share the load. Excessive load on a server, the performance will gradually degrade on the servers as the load increases. You may want to isolate an application to a single server. Fault tolerance. One fails, you've got another one sitting there ready to go. And it may be an addition of a branch office. So we've got a server specific to a branch office. Now we've got two main upgrade methods. We can do an in-place upgrade or a server role migration. Now an in-place upgrade, you boot to the existing OS and run setup.exe from the installation medium. The server role migration, you perform a clean install of Windows 2016 and migrate the server roles from the old OS version, whatever they had, whatever roles they were performing. Now the in-place considerations, only Windows 2012 and 2012 Release Candidate 2, those versions are supported for upgrade. If you're running server core, you can only upgrade to Windows Server 2016 Server Core. Okay, so let me say it again. If you're running Server Core, an old version of Server Core, you can only upgrade to Windows Server 2016 Server Core. If you want to have a GUI, you want to have that data center, you got to do a clean install on it. You can't upgrade to a different language. When it comes to migrating from an earlier version, Microsoft recommends a clean install followed by a server role migration. So just migrating the roles. Okay. And you're allowed to migrate from Windows Server 2008 and Windows 2008 Server Core. Let's go. A Server Core is suited for the following situations: acting as a secondary domain controller to provide redundancy for Active Directory, as a branch office server when remote administration is likely, as a RODC server role for a branch office server, as a virtual machine to reduce the amount of resources used, as a specialized single role server providing services such as DNS, DHCP, web, or file services, or it could be just a departmental server. If you need to run any of these roles, you must install the GUI version. So biometric framework, search services, TCP/IP services, Windows deployment services, or wireless LAN service. That's not going to work on Server Core. You need to have the data center, a GUI version. Now, when it comes to Server Core installation is nearly identical to the full installation. The only difference is you choose, instead of desktop experience, you choose the Server Core. Okay. And it's called Windows Server 2016. So Windows Server 2016 is the Server Core, and Windows Server 2016 Desktop Experience is the GUI version. So it doesn't say Windows Server 2016 Server Core. So you won't see core in the name of it, but just know that it is a Server Core. Now when you're logging on the first time, you'll see a command prompt. Instead of a desktop or server manager interface, you don't have that GUI, you've got a command prompt, and it's all through PowerShell. Now you've got to configure the time, the IP address, configure the firewall, the computer name, workgroup, domain membership, activating Server Core, Windows updates. There's a task for each one of these things in Activity 2-6. All right. So the command list, we'll get comfortable with those command lists to get through what we got to get through. Now just keep in mind, GUI is very forgiving, and it's easy for a reason. They want it to be easy for you. If we're dealing with command line or PowerShell, it is not forgiving. The syntax, it's like a programming language to a degree. The syntax has to be spot on, or these command lists will not run. It won't do what you want it to do unless the syntax is correct. Now, don't use Server Core when it's the first server in a network. Don't use Server Core when you need to install server roles and features that Server Core doesn't support. We just went down that list of about 5 things that Server Core does not support. So when the server administrator isn't well versed with using command line, give them the GUI, give them data center. Or if they're not good at remote admin, go with data center, go with the GUI. So if you can't live without a GUI, don't go with Server Core, because Server Core there's nothing GUI about it. Now, all of the files you need to install, they're in that WinSXS folder. These files take up a lot of space. Windows Server 2016 has features on demand to address this problem, enables you to remove these files and free up disk space. Another advantage of removing files is it updates faster. So here we go. You see PowerShell. It's not pretty. It's not about form, it's about function. It functions very efficiently. And once you know it, once you're familiar with PowerShell, there's nothing to it. It's just learning that language, if you will, those commandlets and the syntax associated with them. There's another of the list showing the different names that we've got. Now, to remove all features and restart the server, use the following command. Now, it's a commandlet. There's a verb followed by a noun. So that's a commandlet. Get Windows feature. Where install state is equivalent to available. Uninstall Windows features. Remove. Now, that command removes all files from Windows SXS folder for features that aren't currently installed. Verify the results. You go ahead and use this commandlet. Get Windows feature. This symbol is called the pipe. You've got to have the space, got to have the pipe, got to have the space. So like I said, the syntax is very particular. So you'll verify the results using this command. And then we move forward. We've got a feature file store. Now there's a network share containing the files required to install roles, role services, and features on Windows 2016 servers. Now if you want to create a feature file store, create a network share, assign read permissions for the group that contains computer accounts that access that store. You'll install a role or a feature from the feature file store by using the following command. The commandlet is install Windows feature name. The source is server share. Microsoft has an edition for all types of businesses, large and small, and not just the size of the organization, but the expertise of the network administrator. Editions include Data Center, Standard, Essentials, Multiport, Premium Server, Storage Server, and Hyper-V Server. Windows 2016 Standard and Data Center editions use a core-based licensing model instead of the processor-based model that we used in previous releases of Windows Server. Now, the process of installing Windows Server 2016 is fairly straightforward. Most of the work takes place in the planning phase. Installing from a DVD is common for single server installation as long as the DVD can hold the version. Post-installation configuration tasks include giving the server a name, configuring network protocols, and setting time zone information. Select the network model, install and configure Windows updates. Then, after it is stable and totally updated, then we'll go ahead and we install the roles that the server will perform. When adding new servers to an existing network, you have to decide whether the new server will be a domain controller in the existing domain, a read-only domain controller, a member server, or a standalone server. You can do an in-place upgrade to Windows Server 2016 only if the existing OS is Windows Server 2012 or Windows Server 2012 R2. Now, Windows Server Core is the default and recommended installation option, as long as you're comfortable with PowerShell and you're not dependent on a GUI. It's the most efficient and lightest. Now, we've got Feature on Demand. It enables you to remove Windows feature installation files from the local disk. It makes it possible to save some disk space and allows Windows to update to run faster. All right, that's it for Chapter 2. I'll see you in Chapter 3.